Good evening, dear audience, dear organizers. I want to thank you for inviting me to this event of Becoming More. And I also want to single out, of course, Charles and Annie, whose very heartfelt invitation spoke to me, but also specifically Iris, because ever since I came to know Iris, I've been impressed with her powerful work, and I've been honored by her because she has now made 2 portraits of me. I don't know what to do with that. So thank you, Iris. I dedicate my talk to you, and also to your artist colleagues. The coming generations. Okay, what I want to do tonight is to share some of my thoughts on the importance of the concept of race in the Netherlands. Race is an unacknowledged part of our common sense and academic knowledge production. It is, in my experience, a very important grammar of difference that has been installed several centuries ago, yet we do not like to acknowledge that. We do not like to talk about race. We do not like to acknowledge its operations, yet at the same time it is a fundamental grammar of difference in Dutch society. So that is the main topic that I will be talking about. Of course, the problematic of race is European-wide, but I will be speaking specifically from and to the Netherlands. And I will mostly focus on everyday manifestations of racism. So in my book I talk about different domains in which race is operative, for example, in the way we've built our institutions, on all kinds of different popular cultural domains. But tonight I think I will talk mostly about everyday manifestations of race in the Netherlands, and I will be drawing on experiences of people who are marked as other. That is to say, people who are racialized as black, migrant, or refugees. So I want to investigate the ways in which we got to the place that we are at, where race is a pink elephant in the room. We dance and tread around it carefully, studiously avoiding to come to terms with and to name race as a fundamental grammar of difference. I begin my presentation by quoting 2 people who have inspired me in my work, and the first one is Toni Morrison, the second one will be Edward Said. So Toni Morrison, the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, mentions in an essay called Home, "I have never lived, nor have any of us, in a world in which race did not matter. Such a world, free of racial hierarchy, is usually imagined or described as dreamscape, Edenesque, utopian, so remote are the possibilities of its achievement. How to be both free and situated, how to convert a racist house into a race-specific yet non-racist home, how to enunciate race while depriving it of its lethal claim." This is an important quote that really speaks powerfully to me because it offers us a program of what we should be striving for. It is not to be colorblind. It is not, obviously, that she urges us to be racist. On the contrary, she wants us to see that race, ethnicity, is operative. It gives symbolical meaning, differential symbolical meaning to different people, depending on the way they look. And she wants us to be aware, to look at these processes and to also deconstruct them so that we can live in a race-specific yet non-racist home. Whereas we are currently, of course, living in a racist house. So first of all, I should say that most people nowadays would agree that race does not exist. Race is a fiction, a social construction, but its consequences are very real. Let me gloss that a little bit. In the course of time, since race was invented, there have been all kinds of ideas circulating about how many races are in existence. Is it 5 or is it 30? There are different numbers attached to the number of races that supposedly exist. Nowadays we do not think about that race is an identifiable substance. There's only one race, that is the human race. On the other hand, racism does exist, so there is a first paradox that we are having to deal with. So what will I be doing tonight? I will be talking about the ways that race is a silent but powerful organizer of ourselves, our institutions, including knowledge production, and of society as a whole. First, I will zoom in on the notion of white innocence, which is very present in Dutch society, and I suspect also in a wide range of other post-imperial European nations. So what do I mean by white innocence and how does it manifest? The central question that I ask in my recent book, White Innocence, Paradoxes of Colonialism and Race, is how would it be possible to think seriously that 400 years of imperial rule would not have left traces in the Netherlands itself? How is it possible to seriously think that one can have a history of 400 years of imperialism and that it will not have left traces in our language, in our institutions, in our history, in the ways that we look at ourselves and at others? So I centrally explore the easy and self-flattering assumption that Dutch imperialism didn't leave any traces in the Netherlands itself. So that is the first part of my lecture. There are 3 parts to it. Secondly, I will zoom in on 4 important paradoxes in Dutch self-representation. I will look at those paradoxes as, on the one hand, stories that we like to tell ourselves, about who we are, and as opposed to those narratives which are very flattering to ourselves and very benign and rosy, as opposed to those narratives I will point out a series of factual data which strongly contradict those benign narratives. So I will present you with 4 paradoxes. Narratives that are very lovingly designed to tell ourselves who we are versus what some of the opposing realities are. So how do we keep those lovely narratives standing? We do that by way of white innocence. White innocence, the central concept that I work from. So here I will show you how race is a silent but powerful organizing principle, that grammar of difference in the way that we have organized society and our knowledge about it. Finally, in the third part, I will share some small vignettes, case studies of everyday racism. And then I will also say something about the present moment. I feel that we are in a second phase of anti-racist struggle in the Netherlands. So I will compare the first anti-racist movement, the first anti-racist period, end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, and where we are now in the second phase and what some of the differences are. I will also talk about the necessity of attending to race. Why is it necessary that we change our ways of dealing, but more correct is to say the ways of not dealing with race in the Netherlands. If we want to live in a society that is radically egalitarian, inclusive and decolonial, and those are also some of the mottos that I see passing behind me, then there is significant work to do for everybody, really, if we want to realize such a society. Just a second. So I was saying, besides Toni Morrison, I've also been inspired in my work by Edward Said, who wrote, among others, Culture and Imperialism. This work has also been very inspirational. And so I have had to, because he doesn't really become very concrete on what to do with the notion of the cultural archive, I've had to think up ways in which one can operationalize the cultural archive. So what is the cultural archive that Said is talking about? He talks about a general 19th century European context in which a storehouse is formed. And that storehouse houses a particular knowledge, structures of attitude and reference, and in Raymond Williams's seminal phrase, structures of feeling. There was virtual unanimity that subject races should be ruled, that there are subject races, that one race deserves and has consistently earned the right to be considered the race whose main mission is to expand beyond its own domain. So I want to point this out to you. So the way that Edward Said talks about this storehouse that is installed in us, in our brains, what is between the ears, but also in our hearts, in our feelings, gives an understanding to the depth of what the imperial project did to the people in the metropoles. And very central in installing that storehouse is, of course, the difference between us and them, us who are white, who are superior, and them who are of color. This is the sine qua non of the imperial project. What he is saying here, and why it is important, is that he's one of the first ones, although he's not the first one, of course, but he's one of the important scholars within the humanities who, by looking at the literature of Britain, points out how in that literature the minds and the hearts of people in Britain are prepared to become colonizers, to become members of an imperial power. And what is so important about Said's work is that he poses that what is central to Western culture is the centrality of imperialism. So this was like cursing in church, of course, because we have all kinds of elevated ideas about what is central to Western culture. It's rationality and equality and what have you, all kinds of nice, self-flattering things. And he is like what Sarah Ahmed calls a killjoy by positing what is central to Western culture is imperialism. He calls imperialism the determining political horizon of modern Western culture. Secondly, what is important about the quote that I just gave you is that he is in fact saying that a deep structure of inequality in thought and affect based on race was installed in 19th century European imperial populations, and that it's from this deep reservoir, the cultural archive, that a sense of self has been formed. Now, Said talks about the 19th century, that is the moment when that cultural archive is installed, but I would argue that for some European nations it was much earlier, like for the imperial European pioneers, among which is Portugal, Spain, the UK, but also very prominently the Netherlands, that already in the at the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century, this storehouse of thought and affect must have been installed. And it is this Dutch sense of self that I'm centrally exploring in my work. I'm an ethnographer, I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, and I'm also very inspired by cultural studies. And what I've done, I've written an ethnography of dominant white self-representation. And I've already mentioned the central question: how is it possible to think after 400 years of imperial rule that this will not have left traces in the metropole, in ourselves, in the people living in the mother country? Okay, since knowledge about imperial systems is so scarce, I will dwell for a moment longer on the incredible vastness of the Dutch Empire. It is something we do not learn about in school. At no level are we taught about what that empire consisted of, or that we even had an empire. But I have to tell you that it has been an incredibly large empire, with not only Indonesia, but also Taiwan, parts of Japan, of China, South Africa, Brazil, Suriname, Dutch Antilles, upstate New York, the forts on the west coasts of Africa. The Netherlands was a huge imperial player. This is not something that we think should be transmitted to coming generations. We do not like to talk about it. We have kind of erased it and forgotten about it. But of course, what is quintessential about having an empire? I will, in the course of my talk, give different views on it, on how different people talk about it. Later on I will be talking about Paul Gilroy, who talks about post-colonial melancholia, and who thinks about having empire or being part of an imperial nation as being embroiled in narcissistic structures, that is, that the self gets all kinds of benefits and privileges just by being a citizen of an imperial nation. But what is without a doubt true is that in any imperial system, it has to be based on racial difference. That is the basis. Whereby European nations sought expansion beyond their European boundaries in order to civilize people of color, in order, as they imagined and as they voiced, in order to help these people of color to reach a higher stage on the evolutionary ladder, and at the same time in order to control and own and appropriate the local natural resources and riches. Another part of looking at empire is the role that it plays, and especially the size of that empire, in giving status to these European nations who engaged in it. So small European nations like Portugal, Denmark, the Netherlands meant something in the world by virtue of having this empire. It brought them prestige in the world, it made them into world players. And again, the quintessence of an imperial project is that difference is made on the basis of race, on white people who are superior and smart and more beautiful, and on them who are of color, who are inferior and underdeveloped. When I was young, and my grandfather from Suriname came to live with us when I was 9 years old, he taught me all kinds of stories about Suriname. And he would tell me stories about white people who came to Suriname, who were good for nothing in Europe, who were drinking, alcoholics, who couldn't hold a job in the Netherlands, but the moment they set foot in Suriname, they rose to the top of colonial society. Like a spear, they went right to the top immediately. Being white in the colonies brought all kinds of unearned privileges with it. One could call it a relentless system of affirmative action for whites during these centuries. This was installed in white people and in black people. And so when my parents came to the Netherlands in 1951, it's part of our family stories that the thing that my parents were most surprised about was that they saw white people here in the streets who collected the garbage. Because, of course, in Suriname, no white person ever in his life would do any manual labor. So this, by these practices, these everyday practices, a differential sense of worth is brought across. So whenever people nowadays say to me, yeah, well, what do I have to do with imperialism that took place so long ago, so far away? Well, that system of affirmative action has also traveled, of course, to the Netherlands. And so it doesn't make any sense to distance oneself in that way from the consequences of imperialism. Another take on empire, in this case on slavery. This is what Toni Morrison talks about. She's talking about, so what has the system of colonialism, of slavery in particular, done to the white psyche? And I want to share this quote with you. Slavery broke the world in half. It broke it in every way. It broke Europe. It made them into something else. It made them slave masters. It made them crazy. You can't do that for hundreds of years and it not take a toll. They had to dehumanize not just the slaves, but themselves. They've had to reconstruct everything in order to make that system appear true. Okay, talking a bit longer about the traveling of ideas between the metropole, between the colonies and the metropole, and vice versa. Because one of the things we have come up with to say that there was no connection between these histories of the Netherlands, the metropolitan Netherlands, and the history of the colonies, one of the things we have said is because we have had colonialism of the exterior taking place way out of here, thousands and thousands of miles away from the Netherlands, that means that it didn't leave any influences in the Netherlands. This is a system, as opposed to colonialism of the interior, as the United States had, where it took place within the confines of the United States itself. So this has offered a very fine way out of taking any kind of accountability. But when we think about the system of thought that was set in motion, the sets of practices that were entertained in the metropole, it becomes clear very quickly that that racial distinction that was made in the colonies could not be confined to the colonies themselves, that that system traveled to the Netherlands. Those systems traveled to the Netherlands. And some of the ways in which that took place were, for instance, by publications about the colonies. For instance, the very famous journal De Gids, in which we find lots of debates and articles more about the East Indies, the jewel in the Dutch crown than about the western part of empire, but many people read this journal. But also by the travel of people and ideas between the colonies and the motherland. Because what was important, what was thought to be important, was that the white people who had gone to the colonies should come back to the Netherlands very regularly in order not to go native. They had to remember that they were white and that they were high above the rest of the population, that they were not the same, and in order to hold on to that idea, they had to travel back to the mother country regularly. So when we look at Dutch literature, for example, Louis Couperus' De Stille Kracht, the silent force, we see a lot of these motives in that literature, that white people couldn't sink lower than to become like the natives, like inboorlingen of inlanders. The reason why I'm standing here is that my father, who was a police officer in Suriname, was entitled to go to the mother country in 1951. He had risen to a rank where he qualified for that perk, that every 6 years Dutch white civil servants were sent to the Netherlands. And so my father had inadvertently risen to a rank where he qualified for that perk, and so we came in 1951. And of course this measure was not meant for him at all, or for the likes of us, but my parents then decided to stay in the Netherlands. God forbid, this book wouldn't be here if that perk hadn't pertained to it. Okay, in my book I show how the concept of race that was installed both in metropolitan populations and in those who went to the colonies, and also, unfortunately, in those who were native to the colonies, that concept of race to this day is a self-evident, natural, but very silent ingredient of the way in which we build our institutions. It is present in all kinds of everyday encounters, in all kinds of cultural traditions and festivities, and also very importantly in the way that we look at ourselves and at the other. So whether it's by looking at ethnic or racial profiling, racism in education, I mean the lower school advice that students of color habitually get when they are 12 years old, and when they need to be selected for the type of ongoing education that they will go in for, we see this racial inflection in all kinds of domains in Dutch society, so also in the labor market. So race plays a major role in organizing our society together with gender and class and sexuality at the same time. So the images that precede the other are very strictly related to what is in our cultural archive, and it very much determines how we act. Okay, so what is this white innocence? I'm invoking an important and apparently satisfying way of being in the world. White innocence encapsulates a dominant way of being us, a way in which we, the Dutch, since the 1960s, think of ourselves as being a small but just ethical nation, as being on the forefront of progressivism on all kinds of issues, from drugs policy to abortion to euthanasia. We think of ourselves as champions of gender and LGBTIQ equality. We are colorblind, thus free of racism. We are inherently on the moral and ethical high ground. We are a guiding light to other folks and nations. So whereas in the past we were somebody in the world because of our empire, now we are internationally significant because of the different courts of justice in The Hague and our human rights organizations which operate globally. So we feel and show that we have something meaningful to contribute. Basically, this self-representation tells us that since we are, by our own acclamation, non-racist, nothing that we can do or say can be racist. Nothing that we do or say can be racist. This is mutually exclusive. We have this very foundational feeling about ourselves of being non-racist. Racism is done elsewhere, in the United States, in South Africa, but not here. Interestingly, this rosy and self-flattering self-representation goes hand in hand with an avoidance of race as a fundamental social and symbolical grammar. We do not talk about race. We do not like to talk about racism. We tellingly talk about discrimination, which again is somewhat of a euphemism. We get very angry when international bodies like the UN or ACRI, the European Commission Against Racism and Inequality, on a yearly basis point out the systematic nature of racism in the Netherlands. The most common reaction to that is, it's not a problem in the Netherlands. Outsiders do not understand us. We know that we are non-racist, and these outsiders basically should keep their mouth shut. So all of this amounts to white innocence. Okay. I will now proceed to the second part, which will talk about 4 major paradoxes in our self-representation. So my main thesis is that an unacknowledged reservoir of knowledge and effect, based on 400 years of Dutch imperial rule, plays a vital but unacknowledged part in dominant meaning-making processes in Dutch society, including the making of the self and the organization of common sense and academic knowledge production. And we also have this unacknowledged reservoir working on society, on a society in which race is a fundamental grammar. In order to sustain this self-flattering self-representation, we need to engage in hard work because we are up against a number of very strong paradoxes which are at the heart of the nation. First, the passion, forcefulness, and even aggression that race in its intersections with gender, sexuality, and class elicits among the dominant white population, while at the same time the reactions of denial, disavowal, and elusiveness reign supreme. This is a bit complicated matter, but what I'm saying is that there is a real contradiction between the forcefulness and aggression that is elicited when race gets put on the table, and at the same time, common reactions are denial, disavowal, and elusiveness. The best way to illustrate this is the phenomenon of the protest against the anti-Black Pete movement, which is full of passion and aggression, and at the same time the possibility that there could be racism present in this phenomenon is vehemently denied and disavowed. So let me immediately add that often people of color too partake in dominant white innocence. It takes hard work to become aware of and disengage oneself from this way of knowing and feeling. Disavowal, so denial, speaks for itself among the three main reactions that I posit. Denial, something is just not true. Disavowal is the psychoanalytical term which references the simultaneous affirmation and denial of a thought or desire. And so, together with elusiveness, these are the three ways in which we do not deal with race in the Netherlands. There are additional paradoxes. The second one. There was, until the last decade of the 20th century, very recently, a very stark opposition between the Dutch imperial presence in the world since the 16th century and its almost total absence in the Dutch educational curriculum and in debates about Dutch identity and society. So when you look at curricula at whatever level of Dutch education, one could never tell the extent of Dutch empire. Students in my classes have always been unpleasantly surprised about the role that the Netherlands has played in slave trade, slavery, and imperialism. And the Dutch people among you will recall the coy remark that our Prime Minister Jan-Peter Balkenende made in 2006 when he was saying that we should return to the VOC mentality, the mentality of the United East India Company, that we should show some more balls, let's say, and be, more active and more self-aware. So it is only the very self-flattering memories of that period that we have held on to. We like to think about the golden age. We like to think about the flourishing of the economy, the arts, the amassment of riches. Those things have been retained in our cultural imaginary, but the nasty parts, the violent and deplorable parts of that history have been erased. At least they are not deemed worthy of transmission. Thirdly, the third paradox, the memory of the Holocaust as the epitome and model of racist transgression in Europe erases the crimes that were perpetrated against the colonized in our Indies and in the western part of empire, that is Suriname and the MT, is for 4th century. So this excision coincides with the representation that the history and the reality of Europe are located on the continent, and that what happened in the colonies is no constitutive part of it, or it's constitutive outside. This frame of mind is still operative to this day. We need to know about the Holocaust, but we do not need to know about imperialism and whatever it entailed. So it is very noticeable in the way that the memory of World War II that we have just gone through again is conceptualized. It is the memory of what happened in the metropole and of the many Jews who were abducted and killed. It is not about what happened in the colonies at the time. And when you try to insert the memory of what happened in the colonies into the general memory, one often meets with hostility and rejection. The 4th paradox is that the Netherlands is a nation of descendants of migrants, with 1 in every 6 Dutch tracing their descendants from a migrant. However, there is no identification with migrants in the present. Something that is also very peculiar and specific about the Netherlands is that migrant ancestry doesn't add to one's public persona. And it is important to shed those ties and memories of migration as fast as possible. You can talk about your great-grandmother who came from Poland or Italy in the personal sphere, and people can and do that, but of course those who look white can more easily lay a claim to Dutchness, to autochthonousness, than those who had ancestry from regions with populations of color. These people, of course, will, until the 4th generation, remain allochtones, those who are from elsewhere. So you see how there is this double standard built in to who can lay a claim to Dutchness. Together, these 4 paradoxes in Dutch self-representation point to innocence, to a foregrounding of being a victim rather than a perpetrator, to a collective tendency to remember the past one-sidedly, only positive aspects of the empire, not the aspects that had to do with violence, with racism, with deep injustice. We forget, we gloss over, we do not work through the imperial past. Until very recently, there has been a consensus about maintaining silence towards the imperial past, because it took place so long ago and so far away that it self-congratulatorily did not leave any traces in the Netherlands itself. So a rosy, self-flattering self-representation, which I've called white innocent, is reproduced, embraced and defended, while there is not any pertinent knowledge or research at its basis. The 3rd part of my presentation. I don't know how I'm doing for time, Annie, but yeah? Okay. We live in a special period wherein finally, from different circles in society, academic circles, literary, artistic, and activist circles, are speaking out and insisting on tackling racism. Some are insisting on the study of the Dutch imperial past that has not been worked through. And I am even arguing that we are in a second anti-racist wave after a first one at the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s. My own work fits within this choir of voices that ask to break through the incapacity, the lack of will, the blindness to deal with the ongoing imperial inheritance. When I think about the first wave, there are several important things that come to my mind. In that movement that came out of the women's movement, mainly black women were especially prominent. There was a movement among black women who together, women from very different walks of life and different ethnic groups, like women from Indonesia, the Moluccans, Suriname, Dutch Antilles, but also Moroccan and Turkish women got together and developed an analysis, a fledgling intersectional analysis of our own position. This was something that was done much more by women than by men of color, black migrant refugee men. A second feature of that first wave was the Prinsenhof conference, which took place in 1984 in Amsterdam. I was a young civil servant who was hired at the city of Amsterdam, and I was responsible for writing the anti-racism policy paper of the city. So it was very alive, and especially in Amsterdam, which is always on the forefront of many societal movements, it was really alive. I don't even want to go into what happened to that anti-racism policy paper, but at some moment somebody thought we need to get involved in this. I also want to point to the work of Philomena Asset. She is the first one in the Dutch context to point to the systematicity of everyday racism. She coined the term everyday racism. Now, when we are looking at this moment, the second wave, according to most people who have been a part of both the first and the second movement, the anti-Black Pete protest in 2011 set off this second anti-racist wave, but I also want to take into account the work that was done by the artists Annette Krause and Petra Bauer in this museum in 2008 with their project on Black Pete. Was it called Becoming Dutch?
The project was Becoming Dutch, but the film was Read the Masks.
Read the Masks, absolutely. Okay, so I also think their work was important. What we see as another difference now is that there are far greater numbers of black migrant, refugee, highly educated youth. People with, who have done university or hogeschool. There are now both men and women in the forefront of this movement. There is a strong claim for inclusive citizenship. We were born here, we are going nowhere, we want to be part, equitable members of this society. I also want to, as a third part of this second wave, talk about the emergence and spread of social media, which have been so incredibly important. Not only the black Twitterati are important in that, but the possibility to set one's own agenda and not be dependent on traditional media is tremendously important. And it really makes a huge difference that traditional media are looking at social media about what is going on out there in society, whereas during the first wave, of course, we would never get into the traditional media. And now we sometimes do because they are forced to. A fourth difference is that I feel that now we're dealing with a network of networks, that in different domains of society there is this anti-racist ethos going on, and it's a fledgling movement, but it's present in the art world, in museums, it's present in academia, and for instance, friend Amanda here, who is representative of University of Color, with whom I've worked together at the University of Amsterdam as the chair of the diversity committee that was operative last year. It's present in politics. I just want to point to Article 1, the political party who I have decided to support, and with which I'm very happy. And not too long ago, sociologist Willem Schinkel of Erasmus University said to me that apart from the party of the animals, Partij voor de Dieren, or Party for the Animals, he thinks that the second major political event of the 21st century is the appearance of Article 1, and I fully agree with that. So there are a number of developments taking place, and what very much ties them together also is intersectional thought. Whereas during the first wave we were still inventing ourselves, we have put intersectionality on the map, and I think that is a major feat that is very hope-giving. Okay, let me just give you a short case study of everyday racism. So last year, when I was the chair of the Commission for Diversity at the University of Amsterdam, we came across a young man, a man of color, who's an associate professor, and he gives a course in methods in a particular faculty. He has a young white man, a PhD candidate, as his assistant. At the end of the block, that is after 8 weeks, it appears that the students have turned their roles around. So the students think that the white assistant is the professor, and they have taken the dark man, the black man, to be the assistant. The evaluation at the end of the course is that this was a good class, but the professor has to get rid of his assistant because he doesn't have a clue. He hasn't understood too many things about what the course is trying to bring across. He's not good in explaining, he's chaotic, etc., etc. So how do I interpret this everyday events that manifests in all kinds of shapes and forms? It is, of course, the cultural archives, the images that precede the young white man are the images that are favorable to him, that put him in a superior position, and the images that precede the black professor are that he's black. So how can he be the superior? This is also my own personal experience consistently, and the experience of a lot of people of color And it is connected to the fact that we have never interrogated our cultural archive. We have never put it in the light and seriously studied what is part of our cultural archive, what we have between our ears and in our hearts. So that cultural archive is still fully operative and makes race, ethnicity into a fundamental grammar of difference. What is more is we have concocted the idea that race is not from here. It is from the United States or it's from South Africa, but we don't have it here. And that, of course, denies the fact that race has been one of the most important export products of Europe. The fact that it is still looked at as an alien body of European thought, that it came to Europe from the US, is really an amazing turn of facts that is all over the place, also in academic writing. We do not have to make race analysis because this is not our thing, it's a US thing. So what does Fatima El-Tayeb say in European Others? She's a German woman of color who teaches at San Diego. She says, to reference race as native to contemporary European thought, however, violates the powerful narrative of Europe as a colorblind narrative, as a colorblind continent, largely untouched by the devastating ideology it exported all over the world. This narrative, framing the continent as a space free of race, and by implication racism, is not only central to the way Europeans conceive of themselves, but it has also gained near global acceptance. There are three terrains that I consider as urgent to work towards a joint, just future. First of all, education. Secondly, I want to say something about our daily interactions in which racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, or a combination of the above play a part. Thirdly, I will point out that there are systematic methods that we need, and among them are rituals to become aware of and to come to terms with the past. We have to pay attention to memorize, to have in our memory present that imperial past. The first one, about education. I think it goes without saying that there is not much words are needed to convince you that the version of history, the dominant version of history that is still being put in our laps in education is very one-sided. It keeps this self-flattering self-image alive by keeping everything that had to do with slavery, slave trade and imperialism to a minimum, or to even discard it wholesale. everybody needs to be aware that the Netherlands has known a global existence from the 16th century on, and needs to be aware why the population nowadays is as varied as it is. So I am in favor of teaching children from primary school on how that came about. I'm in favor of teaching them about race as a grammar, also about gender and class and all those other grammars of difference. I think everyone needs to be aware of the different grammars that are operative in this society. So I'm in other words saying that it is important to spread intersectionality even further to the lowest layers in our educational building. I won't say too much more about diversity at the university. There's a lot to be said about that, but maybe if you have questions you can ask me later. The second issue that I think all of us can work at on a daily basis is to interrupt racism, sexism, homophobia, classism in our daily interactions. One important way in which racism takes shape in the Netherlands is by means of humor and irony. There's a lot of racist jokes being made, and when you watch television, you see it in an unending stream. Whether it's Gordon with his number 31 with lijst, whether it's Jack Spijkerman interrogating Umberto Tan on his knowledge about soccer, and Umberto Tan doesn't know the answers, and then Jack Spijkerman says, "Oh, good grief, you're black and you're stupid on top of it." Then when a little storm arises, he says, Jack Spijkerman says, "I can say that to Umberto because we are such good friends." Then the storm rises a little bit higher, and then he retracts and says, "Oh, what? I shouldn't have said it." It is an illustration also of what I have earlier called disavowal. That is that in the same breath in which you admit that you are doing something racist, saying something racist, you also say, "But I didn't mean it that way, it was a joke." There is something that I really think I should, that I want to point out explicitly. 2 weeks ago, I went to the opening night of I'm Not Your Negro in Amsterdam, and the filmmaker was also there, the documentary maker, Raoul Peck. At the beginning of this show of the documentary, the director of ITVA announced how important it was to her institution to become more diverse, that they were really engaged in a process of becoming more diverse. Well, so far so good. At the end of the documentary, Raoul Peck is interviewed by a white woman, which I found quite noteworthy, especially in the fact that neither the director nor the interviewer deemed it worthy of devoting any words to why she, as a white woman, would be the most appropriate person to interview this black man. I'm not saying that white people cannot interview black people, on the contrary, I think it should happen, but you should have some thoughts around it. And moreover, you should have a thought about why is it that a black person cannot be found who can do this interviewing. What is happening in this moment, and I hate to say it, but it is true that oftentimes, even among people whom I would consider my allies, the idea that I cannot be racist because I say so, because that has been that is what has been told to me my whole life. I cannot be racist. That this attitude also is very present among progressive white people, whom I would consider to have more intellectual capital and more preparedness to be an ally, to act as an ally. It is not enough to say, I'm your ally, I want to see it. And one of the ways in which I would like to see that is if this white interviewer would have said something about why she was the most appropriate person to interview him, or would have taken the initiative to invite a black person to do this interview. Anyway, this all still in the framework of how do we act in our daily interactions? Do we let racist, sexist, homophobic events pass while we are silent? Oftentimes when it comes to a joke, it becomes very difficult for the person involved, the person against whom the joke is directed, to say something. And I would expect bystanders to open their mouth and to say, I don't think this is okay, this is a racist joke. Elie Wiesel says in Night, silence helps the tormentor, not the tormentor. And the opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference. So our joint mission is not to be indifferent anymore, not to protect ourselves, but to interrupt such situations, whether it's sexism, racism, homophobia, or any other ism. Thirdly, supported by these points 1 and 2 that I pointed out, education and the interruption of racist, sexist situations, it will become easier to find spaces and rituals, to create them, rituals in which we think about and come to terms with that imperial past. I'm not at all interested in inciting a feeling of guilt. That's not interesting to me at all. I find it very unproductive, but I do want you to gain knowledge. All of us should gain that knowledge about what history has meant to our current positionings and the relative gains and losses that these historical processes mean in this moment. I thank you for your attention.